Welcome back to Football Weather. Galen, Clavio, and Matt Blaszka joining you once again. It is Tuesday, February 17th as we record this, as we get ready for some more college football talk. I know you're all excited. Matt, good to see you. How you doing?
Always a pleasure, Galen. I'm glad we're back talking college football as we're, right in the middle of February, spring ball, a couple weeks away. So it's, we're getting to that point where we're starting to look at the rosters a little more, check out, the coaching staff are still starting to form, and we still have realignment news. So we're in full football mode.
Yeah, we continue to rearrange things and for next season, which, I mean, why not? That's basically how it's going to work, I think, moving forward. A lot of moving parts in college football. So we'll talk about that coming up here. We've also got a special guest later on in the show. If you've seen College Football with Sam on YouTube, we've got Sam on to talk college football. We talk about Indiana. We talk about the Big Ten race, Ohio State, Michigan, USC, some Iowa talk in there as well. A good conversation we enjoyed having with Sam, and we're looking forward to bringing that to you a little bit later on in the show. Before we get to that, just a reminder, we're brought to you by Home Field Apparel, your place to go for the finest in college fashions, the softest fabrics, the coolest designs. You can use the code HOME23 and get 15% off your first order from Home Field Apparel. And regardless of whether you're shopping in the Pacific Northwest, like both of us did, clearly, with what we're wearing in the show today, or whether you're shopping in the upper Midwest or the Southeast or wherever, Home Field's got you covered. All kinds of amazing crew necks, hoodies, T-shirts, whatnot. So hit them up, homefieldapparel.com. Follow them on Instagram. Follow them on X. Follow them on Facebook if you're still one of those people that's on Facebook, which I'm sure some of you are. You can go find them. Again, HOME23 is the code for 15% off your first order. Okay, Matt, well, let's dive right into it. A couple of big items, but let's tackle the one that actually changed the way the schedule is going to work next year. We talked a couple weeks ago about North Dakota State making the leap. And then now this week, Sacramento State, who's been banging on the door, desperate to try to get into FBS, finally finds a dance partner of sorts as they are going to be joining the Mid-American Conference. Yes, the MAC, that MAC. And they're going to be doing it for 2026. This is not a geographical fit in the least. Sacramento State, I think, is at least 2,100 miles away from every single member of the MAC now that Northern Illinois is no longer in the MAC. It's not a great financial deal on paper for Sacramento State. They're going to be paying a $5 million entry fee to get into FBS that they have to pay to the NCAA. And then they're going to be paying $18 million for cost of entrance into the MAC. They're not going to be taking television money, and they're going to be paying the travel budget of all the teams that will be coming to Sacramento to play them on the road. This is, on its surface, kind of a crazy move by Sacramento State. What was your initial reaction when you heard the news?
I wasn't shocked. I mean, I was shocked that this actually ended up happening, but they've been talking about this for a couple of years, that they've been trying to get into the Mountain West, the Pac-12. It's surprising that the Mid-American's the one that actually jumped, but I guess when you're looking at that kind of money, the $18 million entry fee, the $5 million just to get in, that doesn't go to them, but to get into FBS, the $2 million, the travel cost, the schools only have to go there once every 3 years. So in theory, like for the schools, it was maybe a no-brainer, right? Like they're like, okay, yeah, we're playing one road game a year out in the West Coast. Doesn't really cost us anything to do it, and it gives us a little bit of revenue. And we talked about it last week. Like the MAC seems to be in the toughest spot, as for the longest time, the MAC was a very geographical conference, the one that outside of the SEC, the one that was still holding very firm on their geography. And then we saw some splintering with Northern Illinois. I believe Akron's been into some discussions with maybe moving over, and now obviously UMass coming back after leaving, and now the Sacramento State one it's a little odd. And as you said, it's this year, so trying to knock out maybe they're trying to knock out those 2 years of no bowl games, or postseason bowls for those first 2 years. But they've been preparing for this. Like they've talked about it for 5-6 years at university. We want to be in the FBS. We're going to do everything we can. They have donors lined up. Their enrollment's growing. And for them, this is probably a brand building exercise to see if they can continue this build and get it on the national map. My question for them would be, like, the MAC is maybe the lowest of the lowest conferences in the FBS. So what does this really do for your brand? And we're going to have Tuesday night MAC action at 10:30 at night in November. So that's a win for the fans. For us, we get to watch Sacramento State that time of year. So I'm curious what you think. I mean, it's like where we're at here. And you know,
Well,
the North Dakota State one made a lot of sense. I think this one is really curious.
I looked at it like this. The president of the university came out and laid out the marketing impact that he feels this type of a move is going to have on Sacramento State as an institution. And I'll go back to what I always say about major college athletics, particularly football, which is the reason that institutions engage in them, is that they get a huge marketing benefit that you couldn't buy advertising equivalents for, because playing games on television and having your brand name mentioned on television matters in a bunch of different ways. And so if you look at Sacramento State, they started agitating towards trying to get up to the FBS level a couple of years ago. And they are trying to position themselves in a spot where they can attract students in a way that other California state schools won't be able to, because they're not playing at the FBS level. And while playing in the MAC is not a geographic fit, it was clear that none of the geographic fits were interested in Sacramento State being there. Yeah. And that's, I think, the thing that got missed a lot in the analysis of why Sacramento State would want to do this. I mean, the Mountain West wasn't going to take them. The Pac-12 wasn't going to take them. Mm-hmm. And there's a variety of reasons for that. And chief among them, I think, is the idea that why would you give another school in your area recruiting advantages by saying, oh, we're an FBS program too? Why would San Jose State, for instance, ever want Sacramento State in their conference, a Western conference, where they're having to compete against them? It just doesn't make a ton of sense. Mm-hmm. So I get it from the Sacramento State perspective, and I understand why people don't agree. But my feeling is, if you want to be an FBS, and I get why Sacramento State does, and you can debate whether or not it's a good idea, but look at them being an FCS, nobody knew who they were. So if your goal is to get your institution known, that's the way to do it. Now, the other thing I'll say, though, is why did the MAC do it? That's the thing I don't quite understand. And I do think the MAC, based upon what you were talking about with Akron, with some buzz around Akron, with Northern Illinois having left and gone to the Mountain West, now you've essentially reduced yourself to a conference where, the furthest west you are is Kalamazoo, with Western Michigan. Right. And your brand package is not particularly high level. And you've got a lot of programs that have struggled. I mean, if you had to think about a MAC school that resonated nationally over the last 20 years, it was probably Northern Illinois. So you just lost the program that had made what little noise had been made from the MAC by and large. How do you counter that? Well, you get into a later time slot potentially on ESPN on a Tuesday night or a Wednesday night by having a West Coast team. Now that gives them some programming. So now you're getting some of your brands a little more exposure. And maybe this makes you more palatable to another program that wants to make the leap and is looking for a dance partner and can't find one in the Western conferences. And maybe it's a team this time that's in the Midwest, or maybe it's a team that's in the Plains, a school that's looking to jump up because they're looking at the drawbridge and they're wondering when it's going to get pulled up, and when are you going to be in a position where you can't jump up to FBS? Yeah. So that's all I'm thinking with the MAC. If your travel's getting paid for and they're paying you money that you wouldn't have gotten otherwise to get in, it doesn't feel like it hurts the MAC in any reasonable way. But I do think that the MAC at this stage is probably in some existential crisis, because if they lose another decent brand out of their portfolio, whether that's Akron or whether it's Buffalo, to Conference USA, for instance, or the American, well, that might be a blow they can't come back from. So this at least gives them some padding if they need to reorganize themselves.
I like what you said about, being the front porch, essentially, right for the university, the branding, what the president talked about, right? And I'm curious with this particular move, if they'll have some sort of, I don't want to say cult following, but similar maybe to the Colorado thing about a couple of years ago, like, oh, Deion's this new hip, coach just was awesome at Jackson State's going to Colorado, going to resurrect that program. And he did fine, obviously brought fans there. And now this story, while it's not, I don't think anybody expects them to maybe compete right away. Maybe they will. I don't know about the program. If that will bring eyeballs not only to the team, but throughout the whole season, where a lot of people are talking about Sacramento State, can they get to that 6 wins? Where it's probably a lot more doable in the MAC compared to maybe what North Dakota State's going to have to deal with the first year, because the transfer portals are already closed, and Sacramento State's been throwing NIL money around already for to some of these players that are in the FCS that are maybe more local. So it is a good moment in time for this university. Again, Galen and I we're not novice about our Sacramento State knowledge, but just from a branding standpoint, it does make sense for them to do this. And as you mentioned, we don't know where football is going to be in five years. So this is their opportunity to say, let's try to go out there, win the MAC a couple times, and maybe we get a call to the Pac-12 or the Mountain West or something like that, where they can position themselves maybe for a different payday and a different brand building, or more steps of brand building of who they are.
Yeah. At this point, a lot of universities are trying a lot of different things. And, the reality is, as much as people walk around saying, oh, there's going to be a super league, or there's going to be a shrinking of access, I think it would require a level of cooperation amongst the top leagues that just isn't there right now.
Yeah.
In order to really be able to do that. Like, the Big Ten and the SEC are not going to be able to split off and form their own super league without getting sued into oblivion for antitrust violations. Right. So that's off the table. They're also not going to split off with the Big 12 and the ACC, because the same problem would happen. Now, I could see FBS, however, splitting off from FCS and Division II and Division III.
Own entity. Yeah.
That could be the circumstance that you see. And I think that's why so many schools are looking to get into FBS now. It wouldn't shock me if you ended up with about 140 schools. I think, what do we have? 130.
138.
138 now.
138.
So are there 2 other schools that might be interested in jumping? Because you don't want to be stuck in FCS if the goal is national exposure.
Yep.
And so that's what I look at both of these at. And I think North Dakota State and Sacramento State, for different reasons, and certainly different levels of success in FCS, said we need to make this jump while we can, because if we don't, we may not be given the opportunity to moving forward. It might just be a closed system at that point. And so that's how I'm reading it.
Yeah.
But I do think with the problem that you'll run into is, I could see several schools in the MAC, Eastern Michigan, and some of the other schools that are in the mix, just being like, we cannot financially do this. Right. And I think there's some schools in the Sun Belt. I think there's some schools in Conference USA that might have the same thing happen. That's going to be the big financial reckoning for the next several years, is how all that plays out, and whether or not there's enough money to sustain what a lot of these schools want to do, which is keep themselves visible on the national spectrum.
Yeah. We're closer to that, I think, than like you said, like a break off or something, because at some point the money disparities can become too big. And even though maybe they're playing these buy games, the $2 or $3 million, what it's probably looking at for some of these teams, is not enough to sustain some of these programs. I'm sure this influx of money from Sacramento State will certainly help some of these athletic programs for a year, maybe 2, but it's not a sustainable amount of money where it's like $100 million, which is, more than 18, obviously, but maybe more sustainable. And you mentioned something else about, not being left behind. You're wearing a sweatshirt here, right? And we talked about them a little bit last week, where it was Montana State, those next 2 teams. But as you said, they're a package deal. It seems like very similar to the Arizona schools. Like their boards are similar. It's very they're coalesced that if that's going to happen, they have to go together. And so I'm curious, like if Montana State, the 2 of the bigger brands, the defending national champs, are looking at this and saying, this might be our last opportunity to make this move, as you said, like be a part of the big boy club before the next move, the big move, whether that looks like it's going to happen.
Yeah. The last thing I wanted to mention in this first segment was this leaked proposal from the Big Ten that has highlighted a compromise plan for a 24-team playoff. Now, I talked about this a little bit on a commentary over on Crimson Cast earlier today, and it's something that I think is worth mentioning because it's floating out there. this was a report from Pete Thamel on the 13th of February about an internal document that laid out what a college football playoff would look like with 24 teams, a 23+1 model, an additional weekend of home games in the playoff, a lack of automatic qualifiers, and then essentially a structure that would bring almost the entire top 25 into a playoff. This was met with some derision and some laughter from certain circles, but as I've talked about before, Matt, we have a real impasse right now in terms of what to do with the playoff and in terms of how the SEC wants to maneuver things versus how the Big Ten wants to maneuver things. I thought a lot of the negative commentary about the 16 or the 2014 playoff seemed to come from SEC dominated voices who conveniently leave out that a 16-team playoff would almost certainly include multiple SEC teams at the expense of Big Ten teams or teams from other conferences because of the way that we've now seen the College Football Playoff Committee handle SEC teams in terms of their overall rankings for a couple of years.
So there's a lot to unpack here. I read the memo, whatever they're calling this, the 23+1, and it is interesting laying it out and actually looking at what it looked like. I've been a big proponent of the home playoff games. I think that's really important. I think it's unfortunate that schools like Indiana, Ohio State didn't get home games this year. That their first real appearance was in a bowl game. Like I think that needs to be a reward for being a top seed. So to me, that's something that needs to be looked at no matter what the playoff field looks like. I'm not fundamentally opposed to a larger field. At this point, I'm trying to figure out in my mind what is the next step. And I've said this on multiple podcasts or our podcast. We've had 2 iterations of the 12-team playoff, and I think for the most part, that they figured out the seeding after the first year, and this year was a lot better, I think, than just because it was straight seeding. It made a lot more sense, and I felt like a real playoff. I think compared to last year, where it was a little wonky with how it worked out. And I've said this on multiple times. I always just want to see something bake a little bit before we said, let's do something different. And that's always been college's football thing. And I'm not, like I said, I'm not fundamentally opposed. I think there's some good arguments for the 2014 playoff. There's not a lot of data points, and we need to fix the out of conference scheduling, right? There's rumors of Alabama and Ohio State canceling. I fundamentally understand why Alabama would do that, right? They're seeing the loss column. We don't want to lose an extra game. Texas has used that all off season about why they're not in the playoff. And so there's a lot of these things that I think need to be considered before we just jump into this next thing. And I'm glad I'm happy Big Ten's putting the first here's a proposal, right? Where I don't think the SEC has said anything outside of we want a 5+11. That's it. Like they haven't really come out with anything new since last spring, if I'm correct here. So there has to be some sort of happy medium. And I think one of the bigger sticking points, at least in my mind from the SEC folks, is probably that SEC title game. It just makes way too much money compared to the other games historically, right? And I know I'm jumping all over the place, but I think there's a lot here that needs to happen. But I'm glad that the Big Ten said, here's our first olive branch. I think Andy said that. Andy Staples said this. This isn't you don't say no right away. You say, okay, let's look at this. How can we fit this into maybe the next iteration of what this looks like? But also, let's do our due diligence. Let's just not jump into it. Let's actually figure out all the pieces before we just say, let's do it. And that's been college football's, stance forever, whether it was the BCS or this, like, oh, we got to tweak the formula. We got to do this. Let's try to figure out how we get there, figure out the calendar, do all these pieces, then figure out the 2014 playoff, if that's what it goes to.
I mean, yeah, I agree with all of that. My concern right now, I guess, is what you're dealing with at this stage is a combination of 2 things. One, what's the pathway forward as far as the way college football is going to handle the postseason? Everybody seemed to be in agreement that something needed to change in terms of the formatting or the selection process this past year, but everybody was so far apart on what the potential format change would be that they didn't, like, no one could agree on anything. Yeah. The thing, I agree with you in terms of letting things bake. The problem is not letting it bake. It's like, what are the ingredients that you're baking? And my concern is the basic idea that ultimately the whole aspect of how the committee operates is based upon bad reads and bad information, or at least incomplete information. Because as we saw, and I forget who it was that I saw pointed this out, it was one of the national media members, but Vanderbilt was ranked ahead of Iowa going in. If there had been a 16-team playoff, Vanderbilt would have made the playoff. Iowa would not. Those two teams played in a bowl game, and Iowa won.
And Vanderbilt played their starters.
And Vanderbilt, it wasn't like Vanderbilt wasn't trying. Last year, all we heard about was South Carolina being great. What happened to them? Well, Illinois beat South Carolina in a bowl game, and South Carolina was trying. Michigan beat Alabama in a bowl game last year. Alabama was supposed to be a playoff caliber team. We continue to see, through the inflation of numbers and the inflated opinions that many committee members seem to have of the SEC as still being the dominant conference, as if it's still 2015. I don't know that we have a format right now that is effective in terms of how we're evaluating teams for a 12-team playoff or a 16-team playoff. And so that's where I get the idea that we probably need to expand this thing, because as I mentioned in my commentary from earlier, as much as people want to pretend like the regular season still matters and is still the thing that should matter the most, the regular season, as we talk about in our interview with Sam here in a little bit, the regular season is not very representative of who the best teams are. And if you want evidence of that, I'll point to the teams that have gotten buys in the first two college football playoffs being 1-7. I mean, there's clearly a problem in terms of the overall evaluative process, and even just the basic idea of, you finished 12-0 in your conference or 11-1 in your conference, you must be one of the best four teams. So I say all that with the idea that it just feels like we're at a point where the regular season isn't representative enough, and you don't have a good setup in terms of the committee picking the teams to get into the college football playoff. So that's where I'm like, as much as I'd like to see this bake for a little bit, I think we already know that the ingredients that are going into the recipe are probably not what they need to be to actually get a fully representative postseason.
Yeah. And so all really good points here. I think the one move that I think is really going to maybe quote unquote help is that everyone is now at 9 conference. The Power Four is all at 9 conference games, right? So and not all the ACC teams are, like a couple have 8, whatever, but everyone pretty much is playing 9 conference games. So now we're all playing, not even a majority, close to 50% of our conference, which I think you even mentioned this in previous podcasts too. That's still not a large percentage. Like Ohio State missed everybody last year. They played nobody until they played Indiana, right? And none of the top teams played with Michigan and Indiana last 2 games of the season. So we're still missing those big games. And I keep going back to, I wonder if there's some way, and this is getting a little on a tangent, but to have some sort of national scheduling for that 10th game, right? Where has to be a Power 4 game or something. So we're getting more data points to at least help us dictate the schedule a little better, where we're just not, Indiana plays Notre Dame in 2030 or 2030. Hopefully they're both good. We don't know, right? We just don't know.
I mean, you're right. But then and I think that would solve some of the problems. The problem is, though, like, what if you had gotten Clemson as your Power 4?
Oh, yeah.
Well, it's like, hey, surprise, good for you. But that's where, again, I think the committee has, again, demonstrated that what they privilege is not losing. And so the emphasis is on not losing. And so, of course, teams are going to only play the games that they're required to play, and those are the conference games.
Yeah.
Is there a better way to do it? Maybe. Maybe there is a better way of doing it. I think there's certainly a better way of doing it than what we've currently got. It's just a matter, in my opinion, of now, how do you reconcile that with where the current and the near future aspects of the sport are going? Because I don't think you're not going to get a situation where the regular season is suddenly going to be easier to get a sense of who the best teams are. And I think we've seen now in 2 consecutive playoffs that the best teams that we thought were there going into the postseason were not necessarily the best teams at the end of the postseason. Of the 4 that played in the 2 CFP championships, only one of them entered seeded higher or lower. What was Notre Dame was the 7 seed, I think.
Yes.
Ohio State was the 8 seed.
One was 7, 8, I think. Yeah.
Miami was the 10 seed, and Indiana was the 1 seed. So that's not a great track record for a committee that's supposed to be have all these insights into how good the college football teams are that they're putting into the playoff. That's my only point.
Yeah, and I think we talked about this when A&M lost to Texas, right? And we said they were 11-1 with really no meat on the bone, but we're going to put them in based on them being 11-1 and not really looking at maybe the totality of the totality of their entire package of wins. They were being propped up by a Missouri win. I think it was Missouri that they were ranked at the time. Like, well, they're not ranked now. So like it was the SEC of propping up where like, let's say Texas ends up 10-2. Like I would have put a 10-2 Texas over an 11-1 A&M at that point. Right. Or if they don't play the Ohio State game. So as you're mentioning, the loss column is the issue. Like we're not evaluating the teams properly at that point, because I think even you and I said like A&M probably should be 8, maybe 9, maybe 10, maybe even out compared to Notre Dame or Miami or whomever. But to your point, it's like there's no incentive to schedule these games, and it's a shame because the one thing I, as a fan, and this is not what I think of the playoffs, and I know we're devolving here, is I would be concerned about a September schedule that is just light. And if you look at our week 1 next year, it already is light because we don't have that big wow game. I think the Ohio State Texas game is week 2 this year, so it's something that, again, there's a lot of other pieces that I need to fall into place if there's a new playoff or whatever that final number is going to be, that need to be rectified to help this sport so we're not losing the Alabama-Ohio State game. The Florida, I'm looking at Georgia's schedule specifically. They're playing 11. They're going to play 11 FBS teams in 2027. They're playing in 2020. They're also doing that as well. So are those – that's probably not going to hold. I would assume a lot of these games are going to continue to be canceled because they're not going to want to play that extra game. And that's a shame for the sport because we miss out on those maybe rare matchups that we're not going to get. And there's, like you said, there's no incentive to do it. But I don't want the sport to lose September, I guess, And
I think that's a reasonable thing. But that's where, to go back to what we talked about with Sacramento State and division like FBS, maybe now's the time for FBS to grow a pair and set some rules about scheduling and say, hey, guess what? No more FCS. Yep. You can't schedule FCS teams. You got to schedule an FBS. And, oh, by the way, you can only schedule one group of 6 team in your non-conference every other year or something like that, or one a year. At the very least, then you consolidate the scheduling up a little bit. And see the problem, and this is where, and we'll go to a break after this and come back with our interview. But this is where there was an interesting article from Bill Connolly, who I've had on Crimson Cast. I really respect Bill's work. He's the proprietor of SP Plus on ESPN. But the column was really all about the more you try to pull the drawbridge up in college football, the worse the sport gets, and that's where the problems come in. And it's like that's fine, but the flip side of that is you can't have it all. Like you can't have a division where you're supposed to be playing for the top of the sport and have great non-conference scheduling and also have the ability to schedule a whole division down with no penalty. Maybe it should be, okay, you can schedule the FCS team, but it only counts for half a win or something like that. Like if you're not going to use a stick to say you must do this, you can't also give carrots out and say, oh, we're going to count those wins as if they count for everything. And I'll throw Indiana into the mix on this as well. Like they're playing an FCS team every year because that's where the incentives are, is winning games. We've got to start but it all to me comes back to the idea that the regular season is the most important thing. But by doing that, you're making the regular season less valuable because it's not the regular season that's the most important. It's not losing in the regular season that's the most important. And I think that's the crux of the issue here.
Yeah, I 100% agree, right? So like until you fix that specific issue, and you're gonna ding teams for playing, as you said, Indiana's playing. They playing this year. They playing Howard. Is that right?
Howard, yeah.
Howard. So it's only half a win or whatever it's going to be. But like Ohio State beats Texas, that doesn't hurt Texas as much, or whatever. They obviously lost the game, but they shouldn't be dinged for that. They should be applauded for playing that game. You still lost, but it shouldn't be like, nope, they're 9-3, they're out. Like, and we know Texas had other issues, and it wasn't on the outside. But the point is, we want to incentivize some of these games. We want to preserve some of those things that still do matter to people. But we also need to move the sport forward to the next iteration of what it's going to look like. That's the
thing. For me, that's it. Yeah, I mean, Texas didn't get kept out of the playoff because they lost to Ohio State. They got kept out of the playoff because they
lost to Florida.
That's
by 20.
And like, you don't get to erase that loss because you played a good game elsewhere and lost. So,
right. Yeah.
Anyway.
It's just, yeah. Yep.
Anyway, we'll take a break. We'll come back. We'll have college football with Sam joining us after the break. Stick with us here on Football Weather.
Hoosier Nation, want a smarter take on IU sports? Then check out Crimson Cast, your go-to podcast for Indiana football, basketball, and beyond. Hosts Galen Clavio and Scott Caulfield bring you game previews, instant reactions, history, and context to make Indiana sports come alive. From the biggest moments on the field to the storylines shaping the future, Crimson Cast keeps you informed and connected. And after years of saying bring back the Bison, IU actually did it. So if IU listens to Crimson Cast, maybe you should too. Just search Crimson Cast on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or YouTube.
And joining us now on Football Weather as we continue bringing guests from around the college football landscape, we've got college football with Sam joining us. Sam has been nice enough to have me on his show a couple of times now to talk about Indiana. So we wanted to have him on Football Weather to talk about everything we saw this season, not just with Indiana, but also what we're looking at moving forward as not just the Hoosiers, but many other teams in the Big Ten looking to make it 4 in a row for the conference. Sam, thank you for joining us here.
Of course. Thank you for having me on. I've been waiting for this collaboration for quite some time, and I'm excited.
Excellent. Well, let's start off with what we saw out of Indiana through the prism of how you watch college football. Matt and I obviously have ties to Indiana. We've talked about it often on the show. How surprising was it to see Indiana perform as well and as consistently as they did throughout the course of this season, even setting aside what they did last year?
Honestly, for me, what was surprising was the prior year in 2024. This year, it was shocking without hindsight that they ended up winning it all and going 16-0. But as the season went on, it wasn't really shocking to see this team play at a top 10 level. I mean, I thought that preseason this was going to be a better team than it was in 2024. I thought that it was going to be a 10 win, maybe 11 win team that would compete for the playoffs, that could actually win a playoff game or two, unlike the 2024 team. And when they, blew out Illinois, I was a little bit surprised that they did it by 53 points, but I thought they would win by multiple touchdowns. That was something we picked on the channel. One of our first, big predictions of the year was that Indiana would handily destroy Illinois because Illinois was overrated in our minds and Indiana was much better, and we were correct there. Where it really began to settle in that this was a top 5 team and maybe even better than that was after the Oregon game. I thought that Indiana would cover. I thought that neutral field, or certainly in Bloomington, that they would probably win, but that just making the trip to Autzen with a team that on paper had a talent edge would be too much. And instead, what I watched is that if not for some penalties that should have been called off sides, and if not for the road environment, Indiana was just the better team. So winning 30-20 and then going undefeated the rest of the year, beating Ohio State while not playing a perfect game. And after that, I picked Indiana to win it all in the bracket, and they blew out Alabama. They depantsed Oregon, which I did not think was going to happen. And then they play Miami in a close game and win it all and are the first ever team to go 16-0. And no, Yale doesn't count. They played like a bunch of high school clubs.
Yeah, and then some teams from armories, which probably doesn't count. Yeah, Matt, go ahead.
No, I mean that Yale team was outstanding back in the 1800s. All right, they were really good. So I mean, I guess pivoting to the maybe the 2026 Hoosiers now as we turn the page, where do you see this team lined up as they head into obviously the Big Ten next year? Maybe some of your favorites, some of what you're looking at as you looked at some of the rosters as the portal's sort of closed. There's still some spots open, but for the most part, it's closed.
I love Indiana next year. Now, maybe I'm giving too much benefit of the doubt, but I did a lot of that last year. With how they were able to clearly play at a high level in 2024, almost every addition they made, where they were going to have a player start, I viewed that player as at least an all Big Ten caliber player or close to it, and I gave them a bump accordingly. And that panned out well. Now, I don't have to do that same thing here because they've added better players and they are returning some key guys. But I am still giving them a lot of benefit of the doubt at certain positions because the staff has mostly remained intact. They do return good players. They've brought in some good players. I just from a general standpoint, because it still is very early, even though I've done a lot of research, I like Indiana's defense to perhaps get better, but the offense probably to regress, even though they return 4 out of 5 O-linemen and the run game should get better. I don't know if Hoover is going to be a round 1, pick 1 type quarterback, and it's going to be hard to replace Surratt and Cooper, even though I do think Marsh is good and at least Becker comes back.
Yeah, it's an interesting question because as I try to remind people, no one knew that Fernando Mendoza was going to turn into the player that he turned into. I mean,
Yes.
no, I don't even think Kurt Cignetti would have foreseen that. But it is also interesting how well Indiana played offensively when you look at 2024 with Curtis Rourke. And Hoover is a bit more like that sort of a player in terms of his physical build and what he does. And when you also consider, we're assuming he will have both of his ACLs intact, Josh Hoover will, which Rourke did not. It does make you wonder, with a better offensive line than what Curtis Rourke had, which I think Indiana will have this year, how does that play out? But I do think it's fair to ask the question, can their offense maintain such a high level? Because it's not just replacing Surratt and Cooper. You also don't have there's nobody on the roster that looks like they could fill the Riley Nowakowski position at tight end, which was a surprise.
True.
And you think about Hemby and Black, two really, really experienced running backs. They go into this year with Turbo Richard from Boston College and with Kobe Martin and then Lee Beebe coming off of a knee injury. I like all those players, but it does make you wonder, will they be able to find the same sort of production offensively?
Absolutely. I think that Nowakowski is an underrated loss. And like you mentioned with the difference between, say, a Josh Hoover or Curtis Rourke type player versus a Mendoza type player, Mendoza could make huge plays with his legs. And I'm curious to see, I don't think Hoover can do the exact same thing. So I'm curious to see what the offense is going to do with that and how that's going to change. I'm high on the running back room. Very high in it. Already mentioned I'm high on the offensive line, and I do think they'll develop well. But it's going to be a different team, as is the case now in college football, where returning production's a premium. Not everyone gets it anymore, and there's constant transfers in and constant transfers out.
There's a lot of conversation. I'm wearing the Oregon Duck shirt today. Obviously, as you mentioned, they got pants by Indiana the semifinal last year. They're returning, arguably one of the better quarterbacks from last year, Dante Moore, and a very young team that's coming back with probably a lot of their players that maybe didn't play the full season. They had a lot of injuries. Do you see Oregon as the biggest threat to Indiana in 2026?
Yeah, I would say yeah. And I would say that and not say a Texas or Ohio State or Georgia or Notre Dame because of what Oregon brings back on the defensive line and how they've been able to effortlessly reload on the offensive line year over year over year. And they have Dante Moore coming back, as you said. They have a really good secondary that was young, that is going to be a year older across the board. I mean, they had Aaron Flowers, Ifeoma Badegwu, and Brandon Finney that were all redshirt freshmen or true freshmen. They all come back. They bring in Coy Parrish. And they also, look, I know they're replacing both coordinators, but I think Hampton could be an upgrade over Lupoy. Maringer's been trained under Stein, and I think Lanning's a pretty good coach. Looking at, my spreadsheet here where I've listed all Big Ten players and some of the coordinator rankings and things, they have the best defensive line, I would say, in America, and probably comfortably. And, when you have Jamari Johnson, who's like, I think 6'5", 6'6", insanely tall. He's massive. When you have Evan Stewart presumably having a full healthy preseason and another year of Decorian Moore, Jeremiah McClellan, they had a lot of younger players last year and also some older players. They bring back all the younger players and they don't go in the portal outside of maybe a few backups. And their entire starting defensive line, who all would have been drafted day 2 or day 1, decide to come back. And it reminds me a lot of Ohio State in 2024. So, yes, I think Oregon would be the biggest threat.
The one question I have on Oregon is the schedule, as they got to go to USC, they got to go to Ohio State, they have Michigan coming into Autzen, and they've got Washington coming into Autzen. That's a pretty tough slate. But, Sam, that's the case really across the Big Ten. It feels like everybody's got a lot of tough games. We'll come back and talk about that in a minute. But I'm curious specifically about Ohio State and Michigan. Both of, obviously, the last 2 national champions before Indiana wins it. Ohio State was, I think, in most people's minds, the second best team in the regular season last year. They bring back Julian Sayin. He has a full year of starting experience under his belt, but a very difficult schedule for Ohio State and another coordinator replacement, this time on the offensive side of the ball.
Yeah. As for Ohio State, look, I think that they're always going to be at worst top 10 power rate under Day. I probably would have them top 5 power rated this year. Bo Jackson's one of the best running backs in the conference. Their offensive line has been a weak point for a few years now due to some recruiting and other issues, injuries, and in other years where they've developed well that kind of cancel that out. But they do return Hinsman, Montgomery, and Sierreveld, so the left side should at least be good. It's just going to be a question of, can they fix the right side, and can the whole unit, including the left side, function well? I mean, they struggled at times against Indiana. They were never able to run block anywhere on the field against a good rush defense, and Miami physically tore them apart while not doing, the same weird disguises or complexities that Indiana did. They just physically tore them apart. And even when Ohio State struggled at different positions, you really haven't seen that for a unit since their 2021 or 2022 defense, where superior offenses could just physically blow them off the field because they weren't that good and had a cap. So that's going to be interesting. And that's where I think Arthur Smith is an underrated hire by some, because he'll know how to use the tight ends and he'll know how to utilize the offensive line strengths and try to hide their weaknesses enough from his NFL background and from how he's worked with offensive lines and tight ends to better protect Sayin and try to improve the rushing attack. I think the greatest strength for Ohio State yet again is they have Jeremiah Smith and no one else does. And their safety room, they lose Caleb Downs, but Terry Moore, if healthy, is an elite safety. I like McLean a lot. And they finally have a good kicker in Connor Hawkins, transferring in from Baylor, which the kicking game has cost them over and over and over again. Where I have questions about them is that I think this year was supposed to be their all-in year, and then they reloaded at a much quicker pace than they thought. And a lot of their day 2 or day 3 guys turned out to be day 1 guys, and they beat Michigan and they reached the Big Ten title game. And a lot of those guys that were supposed to come back this year, but instead of going pro, didn't have the incentive to return. And then they lost a lot of their second string and third string players to the portal, because really everyone except for Texas and Oregon, I mean, even Texas and Oregon had to make business decisions with a few backups. It's just the way of the modern era. So there is some turnover there. They do bring back Sayin. I don't quite have them up on the level of Oregon or even Indiana right now, but they're close. Any thoughts from you both before I go on to Michigan?
No, I agree with all of that. I think ultimately, I always will trust Ohio State is going to be very difficult to play against and be very physical. But again, it's similar to what I said about Oregon. They just have a very difficult pathway throughout the course of this season. They got to travel to Texas early. They got to travel to Indiana. They got to travel to USC. It's a very, and they got to go to Iowa as well, which, as we know, is not an easy place to play. they do feel like more of a 10-2 type of team again this year than a team that would contend for undefeated. I don't know, Matt, do you have any thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, last year was so hard to figure out who they were because they played a Texas game and their next real game was against Indiana. I know they played Michigan at the end, so it seems like as Sam, as you mentioned, they had to totally reload for the first time, really kind of learning how to use the portal. And I'm curious how those guys like integrate with what they've obviously a bunch of 5-star players, and they always have a really good recruiting class. It'll be the first time we see Day really have to implement that strategy of bringing in these 1-year, maybe 2-year guys. So it'll be interesting to see how they adapt to that. What they do still have the quarterback, and you said they have Jeremiah Saying. So like that's or answer. Jeremiah Smith, Jeremiah Saying, same guy. Combine the two guys. Jeremiah Smith, who's obviously probably the best player in college football. So I think they'll transition well. They're always obviously in the mix, as Galen said. They should still be 10-2, but that schedule is really tough. It's not going to be what it was last year.
Yeah, it's it's brutal. I think it's either them or Northwestern, I think, is the toughest schedule in college football. It is. I mean, I have Oregon, Indiana, and Texas as my top 3 power rated teams preseason. And Ohio State plays all of them and 2 of them on the road. And then Michigan, Iowa, and USC, I literally have, I think, 9th, 11th, and 12th in my way too early top 25. And they play 2 of them on the road and 1 of them at home. I mean, that you have, for the first time in a while, 6 games where their win probability probably isn't above 60% in like 4 or 5 of them. And that's
wild.
Nuts. Yeah, it's wild. As for Michigan also has a very tough schedule. It's not quite as tough, but Michigan also doesn't have quite as good of a roster. It's probably closer to Ohio State's than it was last year or in 2024, just because Ohio State lost a lot more to the draft, got a lot more players drafted, and Michigan was a young team that returns a ton and did well retaining as many guys as they could in the portal. With Michigan, I think they're going to be like Utah last year, where their run defense will be a problem. And, Kansas State ran for like 500 yards on Utah and should have probably won that game.
One of our favorite games of the year, Matt. I remember talking about that one.
Yes, that was crazy.
I watched that second half, and that was a phenomenal game. But I think Michigan could be very similar to that this year, where their pass defense is going to be great. Underwood's going to take a huge step forward. I do expect their rushing attack to be one of the best in the Big Ten, from a O-line, running back, and then scheme standpoint. The run defense is what's going to be the question. I think that the Oklahoma game obviously is pivotal because it's non-conference, right. But I think due to build, the Iowa and even Indiana games will be a lot more telling. If they can really stop the run in those games and win both, or at least play Indiana competitively while establishing themselves on the defensive line of the scrimmage, I think they could be a top 10 team and one of the 10 or 15 teams that could compete for it all this year if things fall their way. But they also have a pretty low floor, lower than you'd expect for a team with their roster. If, say, some of the development I'm giving them benefit of the doubt to make doesn't happen on offense, and some of the concerns that I have on the defensive line and linebacker aren't fixed. I mean, they lose their top 3 linebackers, and I think they lose 4 of their top 5 defensive tackles. That's hard to replace.
Yeah, that's a lot. What do we read anything into the news today about the general manager getting, I don't know if he was dismissed or is leaving? I saw that story. I hadn't looked into it too much. What is the situation there in terms of how the player personnel is being run at Michigan?
I don't know a whole lot about recruiting. I follow it to the point of seeing who gets the best players and then assessing on top of that who can then develop those players. I would say that, McGee was probably a good general manager. I mean, recruiting was not a problem at Michigan. Yes, they have a much bigger budget than most do, but they also did sign top 15, top 10 classes. I just think it's a parting of ways from the old way of doing things, from more staff and probably some philosophical disagreements between him and Whittingham, or maybe him and some Michigan brass. I think that Michigan's portal class was somewhat disappointing this year. That may have something to do with it, but that also may have something to do with the fact that this team, while older than last year, still has a lot of players who will return for 27, and 27 might just be the all-in year. So they're saving for that. I don't exactly know. Sorry that I couldn't answer the question in greater detail.
No, and it's fine. And it's one of those, this is such a weird time in college football because I think everybody's trying to figure out how do we handle personnel? I mean, Cignetti at IU has been very forward in saying, I'm making all the decisions. I've trained my whole life for this. Not every coach is like that. Whittingham, however, is the kind of guy I could see perhaps saying, I don't need a separate personnel guy. I've been doing this my whole career. I can figure it out myself. And so it's hard to say. If there was information that hadn't floated down here, 6 hours south, I was just curious if maybe you'd heard it. I do want to say it does feel like that quadrant of teams is, maybe the best of the teams in the conference. We've talked about USC some. That's a team I wanted to hear from you about. Is there anybody else that you think bears particular focus as we head into this season in the Big Ten?
Two, I would say Iowa and Washington. USC, it kind of feels like they're, and maybe I'm incorrect in reading this, and I don't think it's a, within the building thing, but just from a research angle and what they return, what they bring back, their coaching hirings and guys leaving, and then what they did in the portal, it feels like they're almost delaying the breakout year another year, and they're trying to go for 2027 or 2028. I don't think that hiring Gary Patterson and then only bringing in a portal class of 10 mostly okay players with 2 good players, the corner, and then I think, let me check. Yeah, Terrell Anderson, the athlete from NC State. That's not really indicative of you trying to compete for a title. I think it's just indicative of you trying to tread water so that further down the line you can have that breakout. Washington, it's year 2 of Ryan Walters with a pretty good defensive roster, and then DeMond Williams and his now number 1 receiver, Desmond Roebuck, comes back. And I'm just keeping it short and sweet there because they also had an OC change today, even though Jed Fish calls the plays. And they're interesting because, DeBoer did well at Washington, but then he didn't leave Washington with much. And Washington under Fish for 2 years in a row, and it'll probably be this way for a third, has been a team that's pretty thin and doesn't have a ton of depth, but their starters are good. They have a good scheme, and they're well coached. I like Washington to win 9 games. If they're able to win both games against Iowa and USC, or maybe pull off an upset against Indiana or Oregon, they could be a playoff team. And then Iowa, I think Iowa's well positioned to have a fantastic year. They return a lot on the offensive line. You cannot get worse at wide receiver than they've been. And they're bringing in some, younger JUCO guys who, I would expect one of them to at least be decent. LJ Phillips Jr., I forget where he played again, but he played, for South Dakota.
Right.
He had 1,920 rushing yards, 19 touchdowns, averaged 6.5 yards per carry. He had 20 touchdowns overall. Bringing him in that running back room with Kamari Moulton and that O-line and how Lester has been able to marry mobility at QB with the running game and, with good enough receivers or tight ends to make things happen, tells me this should probably be Iowa's best offense, even with Gronowski leaving and them having a young QB. And defensively, they lose a lot on D-line, but when you're Iowa with Phil Parker, you care more about secondary and backfield play, and that's what they bring back. They bring back one of their starting linebackers, the majority of their secondary. Special teams should be good, and their schedule's easy. It's one of the easier schedules in the conference, and I have them power rated top 15. So that's a playoff sleeper, I think.
If they can get through the first 6 games with minimum damage, because I agree, like the back half of their schedule is a cakewalk, with maybe the exception of the trip to Illinois. But to go to Michigan, then have Ohio State at home, then have to travel to Washington. And of course, you've got the Cyhawk game at the beginning of September, which they haven't really fared that well in over the course of the last several years. I think that's a real issue. But one of these years, it feels like Iowa's going to have some kind of an offensive breakthrough for Iowa, where it's maybe they'll average 20 points a game. Mostly kidding. But you know, their defense and their special teams are so good, and they have such a home field advantage at Kinnick. It does feel like it's there, but they need to. They are going to have to knock off at least two of those teams, I feel like, to have a legitimate shot at being a playoff team.
Yeah, I totally get that. I think they're going to at least win one of those games because between, Washington, Ohio State, and Michigan, they will match Ohio State and Michigan at line of scrimmage and probably be better than Washington there. And that's enough with their defensive back play. They reloaded at kicker through the portal, where another underrated aspect about them too is their scouting. I mean, I've talked to people who are either in the know it with scouts or different staffs, and mostly referring to like Buffton Prime T-Cal there.
Yeah.
And he loves Iowa's scouting, and I do too. I mean, that's why Nebraska, their rival, out recruits them every year, and Iowa consistently sends triple or quadruple the amount of players Nebraska sends to the combine themselves. They know how to scout, they know how to develop, and they finally have an OC that knows what he's doing.
Well, we'll get you here out. We'll get you out of here on this one. You seem to really be like Texas this year. Can you talk a little bit about Texas as maybe they're your, I don't want to say your national favorite, but you seem to really enjoy, really like where Texas is at this point of the season.
I love where they're at because I think as long as you're in the top 4, top 5, you should love where you're at. It's just so hard to, it's so hard to be there, especially now. I mean, it used to be Alabama, Ohio State, and Georgia could hoard pretty much all the talent, and maybe Clemson some years, or in theory with recruiting A&M, they just bungled the development so badly. That's not the case anymore. The only programs, I actually really say program, that can probably do that at a decent level is Oregon, because of their budget, and also when looking at their recruiting, they've averaged the highest average player ranking in classes for the past 2 years pretty unanimously, and they've held on to more top 100 players than the other major recruiting players. But even then, it's sort of inconsistent. I think that Texas is going to have probably the best offense in the country. I just have questions about their defensive backfield and Muschamp's scheme and the culpability of those, Georgia, Alabama, Nick Saban-like schemes of when they don't have good backers and you play a great O-line with a great quarterback and great receivers, you get shredded, which is what happened to Georgia against Alabama the first time in 21. It happened to them against Ohio State in 22. It happened against, partially because the defense regressed, but it happened in 24 twice when they played Ole Miss and Alabama. Their defenses just got completely depantsed, and on top of that, the offense couldn't do much. And it kind of happened again this past year with Chambliss, because he could compensate for Ole Miss having a shakier O-line, and he could get the ball to his receivers on top of Georgia's defense, which doesn't always provide a lot of help to their defensive backs. So that's probably the reason I don't have them ahead of Oregon, is I think Oregon's roster is probably more complete, on top of on average having better players. But Texas is close. I think that they're going to be the SEC's best team, and they're probably the only SEC team in Tier 1. Before I got on here, as a reason why I was a few minutes late, I was finishing my SEC research, and Texas is in Tier 1, and then you have 6 or 7 teams in Tier 2 that are all within margin of error of each other. So they're in a good place.
Yeah, just looking at this Texas schedule, they don't leave the state of Texas till outside of going to Tennessee once until November. So that plays well for them to get off to a really good start.
Absolutely. I mean, you get Ohio State at home. You should be better than Ohio State, but you never know. Ohio State right now, I would say, is currently the number 1 team in America. Moving forward, I think differently, but they'll still be a top 5 program moving forward. And I mean, yeah, Tennessee's going to be tough. Oklahoma neutral field's going to be tough. I like Florida this year, and they have 3 road games in November, but they'll have the best roster, at least on paper, in all 12 of their regular season games. And it's not like Sark is a crap coach either. He has some of his issues, but that's the case with most coaches outside of maybe your Signetti, Smart, and Day. There's a pretty big drop off, I think, after those top 3.
I mean, and they went to the playoff the first year and made it past the first game that they played. It's a team that's certainly got a ton of talent. They were younger last year. There's going to have to be some maturing, and I agree with Matt. I think the schedule sets up for them if they can put it together. I think there is some hesitancy because people expected them to put it together this past year, and it never really came together for them at any point. So it is going to be interesting to watch that, and I am fascinated to see what happens in the rest of the SEC because I agree. It feels like everybody took a little bit of a step back, or at least didn't take the step forward that they needed. So, well, Sam, this was great. We appreciate it. Obviously, people can find you on YouTube and elsewhere. How often does the show come out, and where's the best place for people to find you, would you say?
The best place would be YouTube, just College Football with Sam. With getting adjusted to school and preparing for just different things in my own personal life, it's been somewhat inconsistent ever since the national championship game. But we try to go live Monday, Wednesday, Friday at noon. After probably the beginning of March, it'll be much more consistent. I just have a trip I'm going on in about a week or so. That'll be a pretty much a 10-day break. But yep, Monday, Wednesday, Friday, noon Eastern time. We do 10 or more different topics in each show just because I like to cover a lot, because I think the more content, as long as I'm reporting on it knowledgeably, the better. So you can find me there.
You can also check the collab link that we've got on this video on YouTube if you're watching on YouTube, folks, and you can find your way over to College Football with Sam. Sir, thank you so much. We really appreciated you joining us, and we'll look forward to talking with you again in the future.
Awesome. Thanks again.